personally, I can't believe that this is a horrible thing.
The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled and people were even standing along the back wall. It felt like all of Reddick, Florida had squeezed into that room. Jesse Stone, a skinny kid with messy brown hair and eyes that looked everywhere but straight ahead, stood before Judge Lisa Herndon. He was 15, but in his too big borrowed suit, he looked more like 12. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked pale, almost see-through. The air in the courtroom was thick and heavy. You could almost taste the sadness and anger hanging there. Mrs. Alara Beaumont, the victim, wasn't in the courtroom. Her family was there, though. Her daughter, Carol, sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Carol's husband, Tom, put his arm around her, his face a mask of fury. Further back, some of Mrs. Beaumont's grandkids sat huddled together, whispering to each other. They looked scared and confused. Judge Lisa Herndon, a woman with kind eyes but a firm jaw, looked down at Jesse from the bench. She had a stack of papers in front of her, but she didn't look at them. She looked right at Jesse. Her voice, when she spoke, was strong, but there was a hint of sadness in it too. Jesse Stone, she began, her voice echoing in the quiet room, for the brutal assault and rape of Mrs. Alara Beaumont, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. 25 years. It was a long, long time. A gasp went through the crowd. Some people covered their mouths with their hands. A woman in the back row started to cry. Tom, Mrs. Beaumont's son-in-law, clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Jesse didn't react. He just blinked slowly like he hadn't really heard what the judge said. His eyes were still darting around the room, landing on faces in the crowd, then quickly looking away. Judge Herndon banged her gavel down on the wooden block in front of her. Bang. The sound was sharp and loud like a gunshot. It made everyone jump. It was a sound that meant business. It was a sound that meant the case was closed. It was a sound that meant Jesse Stone, a boy who had just been playing video games and riding his bike a few months ago, was now going to prison for a very, very long time. He was a convicted felon. The word felt heavy and ugly. 2 police officers in uniform walked over to Jesse. One of them put a hand on his arm. Jesse flinched a little like he was surprised. They led him out of the courtroom through a door at the side. He didn't look back. He just walked, his head down, like he was already walking into the darkness of those 25 years. The courtroom buzzed with noise. People started talking all at once, some arguing, some crying, some just shaking their heads in disbelief. The trial was over, but for Reddick, the nightmare was just beginning. Reddick, Florida wasn't a big place. If you blinked while driving through, you might miss it altogether. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else and probably knew what they had for breakfast too. It was a place of wide tree-lined streets, where giant live oak trees with long droopy branches covered in Spanish moss shaded the houses. The air was thick and sticky in the summer, and the cicadas buzzed loudly in the evenings. Friday night football games at Reddick High were the biggest thing happening all week. The whole town seemed to show up, cheering for the Reddick Raiders under the bright stadium lights. People sat on their porches in the evenings, sipping sweet tea and chatting about the weather or what Mrs. Johnson down the street was planting in her garden. Kids rode their bikes all over town and everybody left their doors unlocked. Or at least they used to. Mrs. Alara Beaumont, the victim in this whole mess, was as much a part of Reddick as the oak trees. She had lived in the same little white house on Maple Street her entire life. It was a cozy place with a bright red door and a porch swing that creaked when you sat on it. Her yard was always full of flowers, bright red geraniums, sunny yellow marigolds, and her favorite, deep purple petunias. She was 91 years old, but she still got around pretty well. She went to church every Sunday, baked lemon cookies for the church bake sale, they were always the first to go, and always had a smile for everyone she met. She was like everyone's grandma. Jesse Stone, on the other hand, was a bit of an outsider. He hadn't grown up in Reddick. He had moved there with his mom, Sarah, and his grandma, Martha, a few years earlier. Nobody really knew much about them. They lived in a small rundown house on the edge of town, a place with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds. Jesse went to Reddick Middle School, but he didn't seem to have many friends. He was always quiet, kept to himself. You'd see him walking home from school alone, his head down, always wearing a pair of big headphones. He never smiled much. He wasn't known for getting into trouble, but there was something about him that made people a little uneasy. Some of the moms in town whispered about him, saying he was different. They couldn't put their finger on it, but they just felt something was off. Reddick was a small town, a place where people looked out for each other. Or at least they thought they did. It was a place where everyone felt safe. Or at least they used to. What happened to Mrs. Beaumont, what Jesse Stone did, shattered that feeling of safety. It made people look at each other differently. It made them wonder if they really knew their neighbors as well as they thought they did. It made them realize that even in a small, quiet town like Reddick, bad things could happen. Really, really bad things. The details of what happened to Mrs. Beaumont were awful. It was the kind of thing that made your stomach hurt just thinking about it. Everyone in Reddick was talking about it, whispering about it, trying to understand how something so terrible could happen in their quiet little town. It was like a dark cloud had settled over Reddick. It happened on June 9, 2024. It was a hot, sticky day, the kind of day where all you wanted to do was sit inside with the air conditioning on. Mrs. Beaumont had been in her living room, probably tending to her flowers or reading a book. Her living room was a cozy place, filled with pictures of her family, her kids, her grandkids, her late husband, George. There was a comfy armchair by the window and a small table with a doily on it. It smelled like lavender, her favorite scent. Some people said Jesse had offered to mow Mrs. Beaumont's lawn that day. They said he'd come to her door, all polite and helpful, and she, being the kind woman she was, had let him in. Other folks in town swore up and down that he just walked right in through the back door. They said Mrs. Beaumont often left it unlocked because she trusted everyone in Reddick. It was a small town after all. Who would think someone would do something so horrible? However he got in, what happened next was truly disturbing. He attacked Mrs. Beaumont right there in her own living room, a place where she should have felt safe. He pushed her down and then he covered her face with a pillow. A soft, fluffy pillow, the kind you'd rest your head on at night. But he used it as a weapon. He held it there, pressed down hard so she couldn't breathe. While she was struggling, terrified, he did something truly awful to her. Something that no one wanted to talk about, but everyone knew. Something that made people's blood run cold. The police wouldn't say exactly what happened. They just called it sexual assault. But everyone knew. They knew that Jesse Stone, that quiet, awkward kid from down the street, had done something unspeakable to Mrs. Beaumont, a sweet old lady who everyone loved. The prosecution, the lawyers trying to put Jesse in jail, called the attack violent and premeditated. That meant they thought he planned it, that he'd gone to Mrs. Beaumont's house with the intention of hurting her. They said it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing. They described how he'd suffocated her with the pillow, how he'd violated her. It was all so gruesome, so shocking. The defense, the lawyers trying to defend Jesse, tried to say it wasn't like that. They said he was confused and troubled, that he didn't know what he was doing. They talked about how he had a tough life, how his dad wasn't around, how he was addicted to bad stuff on the internet. They tried to make it sound like it wasn't entirely his fault. But no matter what the lawyers said, no matter how they tried to spin it, the truth was Jesse Stone had hurt Mrs. Beaumont. He had violated her in the worst possible way. And that was something Reddick would never forget. Sheriff's Deputy Ray Jenkins, a man as solid and dependable as the old oak tree in front of the sheriff's office, was in charge of the investigation. Deputy Jenkins had been a cop for 20 years. He'd seen a lot of things in those 20 years, car accidents, fights, even a couple of robberies. But this was different. This was something that crawled under his skin and made him feel sick to his stomach. Deputy Jenkins was a big man with a weathered face and kind eyes, even though he had to be tough sometimes. He had a wife and 2 kids and he coached his son's baseball team. He was a regular guy, the kind of guy you'd see at the grocery store on Saturday morning. But he was also a good cop, a man who believed in justice. And what happened to Mrs. Beaumont, it just wasn't right. The first thing Deputy Jenkins did was go to Mrs. Beaumont's house. It was a crime scene now, taped off with yellow police tape. He walked through the house, careful not to touch anything. It was a mess. Things were knocked over and there was other stuff. Stuff that Deputy Jenkins didn't even like to think about. He took pictures, lots of pictures. He bagged up anything that might be evidence. A pillow, a blanket, even a doorknob. He knew that every little thing could be important. He talked to Mrs. Beaumont too while she was in the hospital. She was shaken up, scared. Her voice trembled when she talked about what happened. She kept saying, "Why? Why would he do that?" Deputy Jenkins didn't have an answer for her. He wished he did. He just held her hand and told her they would find out who did this and that they would make sure he paid for what he did. Then Deputy Jenkins talked to Jesse. He brought him down to the police station. It was a small, gray building with a couple of holding cells in the back. Jesse sat in a small room with gray walls and a metal table. He looked nervous, fidgeting in his chair, avoiding Deputy Jenkins' eyes. Deputy Jenkins read Jesse his rights, making sure he understood that he didn't have to talk if he didn't want to. Jesse just nodded. He was quiet as a mouse. Deputy Jenkins asked him about the day of the attack. He asked him if he had been at Mrs. Beaumont's house. At first Jesse said no. He said he had been at home playing video games. But Deputy Jenkins had evidence. He had fingerprints. He had other things too, things that he couldn't talk about. He told Jesse that they knew he was there. He told him that it was important to tell the truth. Slowly Jesse's story started to fall apart. He started to cry. He admitted he had been at Mrs. Beaumont's house. He said he didn't mean to hurt her. Deputy Jenkins listened. He wrote everything down in his notebook. He knew that what Jesse had done was wrong, terribly wrong. But he also knew that Jesse was just a kid, a troubled kid. He wondered what had led him to do such a thing. He knew that this case wasn't just about catching a bad guy. It was about understanding why. It was about trying to make sure something like this never happened again in Reddick. Jesse's life wasn't easy. It was more like a puzzle with missing pieces, a story with a lot of sad parts. He lived in a small rundown house on the edge of Reddick with his mom, Sarah, and his grandma, Martha. The house wasn't much to look at. The paint was peeling and the yard was mostly weeds and patches of bare dirt. It felt like nobody had really cared about the place in a long time. Sarah, Jesse's mom, worked at the local diner. She worked long hours, flipping burgers and serving fries, trying to make enough money to keep the lights on and food on the table. She was always tired, her face etched with worry. She loved Jesse, but she didn't always have the time or energy to give him the attention he needed. She was stretched too thin, always struggling to keep her head above water. Martha, Jesse's grandma, was a different story. She was strict, a woman of strong faith. She went to church every Sunday and made Jesse go with her. She had a lot of rules and she wasn't afraid to enforce them. She believed in discipline, sometimes a little too much. She'd yell at Jesse for not cleaning his room or for getting bad grades. But deep down she loved him. She was the one who took care of him while his mom was at work. She cooked him meals, helped him with his homework sometimes, and tucked him into bed at night. Jesse's dad wasn't in the picture. He had left when Jesse was just a baby. Jesse didn't even remember him. Sarah never talked about him much, except sometimes when she was angry she'd mutter his name like it was a curse word. Jesse knew his dad was a sore subject, so he learned not to ask about him. But he wondered. He wondered what his dad was like, if he would have liked him, if things would have been different if he'd stayed. It was like a hole in his heart, a missing piece that he didn't know how to fill. Jesse felt lonely. He didn't have many friends at school. He was quiet and awkward and the other kids mostly left him alone. He spent a lot of time by himself, listening to music on his headphones, trying to escape the world around him. He found a different world online. At first it was just games, a way to pass the time. But then he stumbled across something else. Something dark and secret. Pornography. It was like a drug, a way to forget about his lonely life, his absent father, his stressed out mom, and his strict grandma. It was something he could do in secret, something that made him feel something. He didn't understand the feelings, but it was a distraction. It filled that empty space inside him, at least for a little while. But it was also like a monster growing inside him, a darkness that started to take over his thoughts. It twisted his view of what was right and wrong. It made him see people, especially women, in a way that was unhealthy and disrespectful. It was a secret he kept hidden, a secret that was slowly eating him up from the inside. The trial was a media frenzy. Reporters from across the state descended on Reddick, their cameras flashing, their notebooks filled with the gruesome details of the crime. The town was divided. Some people couldn't believe that Jesse, a boy they had seen playing in the park, could be capable of such a heinous act. Others, fueled by anger and a desire for justice, demanded the harshest possible punishment. The prosecution, led by Katrina Self, painted Jesse as a predator, a calculating and dangerous individual who had preyed on a vulnerable old woman. They emphasized the violence of the attack and the lasting trauma it had inflicted on Mrs. Beaumont. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Jesse was a troubled and deeply disturbed young man, a victim of his circumstances. They pointed to his absent father, his addiction to pornography, and the lack of mental health resources available to him. Mrs. Beaumont, a woman of remarkable resilience, refused to be defined by what had happened to her. She spoke at the trial, her voice trembling but firm, telling the court about the fear and violation she had experienced. She talked about the loss of her sense of security, the way she now jumped at every sound, the nightmares that haunted her sleep. But she also spoke about forgiveness, not condoning what Jesse had done, but acknowledging the complexities of the situation. She expressed hope that Jesse could receive the help he needed, that he could somehow find a path to redemption. Judge Herndon's decision was swift and decisive. She acknowledged the mitigating factors in Jesse's case, his age, his difficult upbringing, his addiction. But she also emphasized the severity of his crime, the profound harm he had inflicted on Mrs. Beaumont. She spoke about the need for justice, the importance of sending a message that such acts of violence would not be tolerated. And then she delivered the sentence, 25 years in prison. The trial was over, the sentence handed down, but the story didn't end there. Reddick was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy, the sense of shock and disbelief that lingered in the air. Mrs. Beaumont, slowly and painstakingly, began the process of healing, both physically and emotionally. Jesse, a boy lost in the system, faced a long and uncertain future. The question of why, the age-old question that haunts every tragedy, remained unanswered. What had driven Jesse Stone to commit such a horrific act? Was it the absence of a father figure? The addiction to pornography? Something darker, something more deeply rooted? The experts offered their opinions, the psychologists and psychiatrists, but ultimately the answer remained elusive. Jesse Stone, the boy who had shattered the peace of a small town, was now a symbol, a case study, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most unexpected places.